Welcome to our posts. Today, we will see stories of r/malicious compliance. New neighbor didn't like my old fence, so I took it down. About 5 or 6 years ago, I built a fence in my backyard. I talked to my neighbors and we decided on a good place to build the fence. We knew an approximate property line based on some survey pins, but were both too cheap to pay for a surveyor. We shook hands and I built the fence. It was a great deal for my neighbors. I paid for everything, built the fence, and all they had to do was give me a thumbs up when it was done. Then, a year later, they sold their house. That meant I got a new neighbor. More specifically, I got Anne. Anne was from the big city. Anne was a realtor. Anne had flipped 8 houses in 12 years. Anne loved this new house and planned on staying for a long time. And Anne had a dog. Rosie was a German Shepherd mix that spent most of the day outside while Anne went to work. Rosie was aggressive towards children, animals, insects, and any plants that waved in the breeze. Rosie also, as Anne once told me, loved to chew on furniture. That's why Rosie stayed outside so much. About 6 months after Anne moved in, I saw a surveyor walking around in my neighborhood, and he was paying special attention to my backyard. The next day, Anne showed up at my front door with a stack of papers and asked me if I was going to pay her for the 9 inches that my fence was encroaching onto her property. I explained the handshake deal with the last neighbors, but she was having no part of it. She wanted the fence moved or she wanted money, no discussions. She had spoken to her lawyer friend and was perfectly happy to take me to court over the fence. She told me, "I don't know how you guys do it out here in the sticks, but where I come from we follow the rules." So I got rid of the fence. The next day I unscrewed the horizontal rails from the brackets, stacked the fence panels up against my garage, and pulled up the fence posts with my work van. About a week later, Anne shows up at my front door again. She wants to know when I'm going to be building a new fence. Turns out, without my portion of the fence, she has not been able to let Rosie out unattended for fear that he will run away, attack something, or get hit by a car. She also told me she can't keep him in the house all day while she's at work anymore. Her furniture and carpet are all but ruined. I told her, "Well, Anne, I'm not going to be rebuilding the fence. I don't want any legal trouble, and the best way to stay out of trouble is to not build near your property." The look on her face was priceless. I thought she was going to cry. She probably did when she got back home. She tried to protest, saying that she really needed the fence back and she would even help pay for the new one. She told me how much she loved the style and aesthetic of the old one. It was just the location that she had a problem with. I stood firm. There would be no new fence. She never got a fence. She made half-hearted attempts to put up some bamboo fencing, but Rosie tore through that stuff like wet newspaper. Eventually, I sold my place and moved away. I took the old fence panels with me, and I still look at them every day when I let my dog out in the morning. Next story. Permanent structure, okay? I grew up in an okay town that has since become a bit snobbier. I was driving down my old street last year and I saw my old neighbor, Andrea, sitting on her front porch, so I stopped in to say hi. Turning into the driveway, I noticed a regulation-sized soccer goal in her next-door neighbor's small front yard, which is very out of sync with the rest of the neighborhood. It made me laugh a little. After a quick catch-up, I learned a couple of things. She's the last of my old neighbors who still lives on the street, and the neighborhood has become very keeping up with the Jones, with the exception of her next-door neighbor. I asked about the soccer goal, and here is the story. The neighbor has a young daughter who loves soccer. She would spend hours in the front yard kicking goals into a small goal anchored in the front yard with tent spikes. Apparently, another neighbor, they don't know who, but they suspect the people directly across the street complained to the township because of the semi-permanent structure in the front yard. The neighbor got upset, obviously. It was basically a toy in the front yard. Cops came to their house. They got a warning. Then they thought it would be okay as long as they took it down when they weren't home. But nope. Cops were called again and they were fined while the daughter was using it. The fine said something about having a semi-permanent because of the tent stake structure. Cue malicious compliance. They weren't allowed to have a semi-permanent structure, but they could have a permanent structure. So they went, got a permit from the township, dug the holes, filled it with concrete, and built a regulation-sized goal and hung the permit on one of the poles. Now the mystery neighbor has to look at that goal every day. Next story. I should talk to HR about leave if I'm legitimately having trouble at work 1 week before my due date. Sure thing, boss. This happened last year. IF31 was 1 week away from my due date and was working full-time in a school administration position. At this time, I had the capability to work from home if needed. Too sick to come into work, catch up on extra work, unable to secure daycare for my child, etc. When I accepted the position prior to my pregnancy, I was told by my boss, let's call her Ronnie, that it was very flexible as long as I got my hours in. I very rarely worked from home and typically only did so for an hour or two in the morning if it was needed later on in order to work before OBGYN appointments, as it was a long commute between work and office. However, I was told by Ronnie after accepting the position to try and limit WFH to 2 days a month, which fine. At this point I was well under, since I was only working an hour or two, maybe twice a month, and only once a month before that. Being so close to my due date, I was experiencing physical hardships that made working on site more and more difficult, such as dizzy spells, a pulled tendon in my foot, and severe back pain. I was also scared of potentially going into labor, while at work, with it being so far away from the hospital my OBGYN delivers at. To top it all off, my coworkers started asking more invasive questions about my pregnancy that made me uncomfortable. All in all, it was not a fun time. I explained all of this in an email to Ronnie and asked for her permission to almost exclusively work from home up until I go into labor. I said I thought it would be a reasonable accommodation, and I work really well from home. Ronnie responded a couple days later denying my request to work from home at all, and said I needed to be there since we would be starting some of our busiest work in a couple months, which I would be gone for on maternity leave anyways, so I'm not sure why she brought it up. But I could talk to HR about leave options if I am truly having trouble working. BTW, it is illegal in my state to require an employee to take leave if there is a reasonable accommodation that can be made instead. Cue malicious compliance. I immediately went to HR and did just that. We talked about options and found out I could start my leave the very next day and still be paid state mandatory leave pay for the extra time. I informed Ronnie that I would be out starting the next day as I needed to take care of myself. She said, I understand you need to do what's best for you, but you need to understand that I need to do what's best for the team. So, yeah, everything I normally managed basically went to crap in my absence, as the other people on the team weren't qualified to do the work and kept taking time off leading up to my due date instead of learning the basics while I was still there to teach them. I left detailed procedure notes and workflow lists, but I later found out Ronnie had to pick up all the extra work and a lot of it never got done since she didn't have time. But it was best for the team, right, boss? Next story. Middle manager wants to replace his coworkers with AI. I'll let him throw the first stone. I own a managed service provider MSP firm which provides cloud computing services to clients. Business is good enough to pay my employees a respectable wage while offering them a good work-life balance. I haven't had to lay off a single employee yet. I hired a senior technician as a middle manager. Let's call him Harry. Harry seems to have gone off the rails about AI. He has started to micromanaging our coworkers to an unacceptable extent, and he has kept on pestering me to investigate how I could use ChatGPT and other AI technologies to reduce employee costs. Frankly, this rubbed me the wrong way. Harry doesn't have a stake in any of his coworkers losing their jobs, and his constant micromanaging had become an issue. More so, I looked at ChatGPT and there's simply no way it could replace any of my technical employees. ChatGPT has no agency, nor can it deal with clients, nor can it see the computer screen to troubleshoot JAXT. However, ChatGPT could easily replace a middle manager, assuming someone else takes on some additional responsibility daily. You see, ChatGPT has a code interpreter mode which can do calculations and process spreadsheets. This can decimate the workload of a middle manager, at least in our firm, allowing their responsibilities to be absorbed by another senior employee, me in this case. I kept this in mind and have been shadowing Harry's job for the past few months. A good employee retired last week. I approached Harry and told him that I took his suggestions to heart and have decided to automate his role with AI. I told him he could accept his redundancy package or be retrained in Azure. He chose to be retrained in Azure. Unfortunately for Harry, he'll lose the comfy privileges being a middle manager entails. Fortunately for our coworkers, they will have an impartial AI making decisions. Fortunately for me, I won't have to pay for a redundant role. Next story. You want me to work 0 overtime? Sure thing, boss. Some context. I work as a manager in a call center. I am nowhere near the phones and generally do not interact with customers. Rather, I am a knowledge repository for my staff and handle communication between our team and the client company which we provide support for. We are a technical support team, not a sales or order support, and the devices which we support are very complex consumer electronics. Most of our support time goes to professional installers, and we rarely speak to customers firsthand. In short, my job is to know our policies like the back of my hand, and to know the products we support better than anyone except the designers that engineered them. A secondary part of my job is to coordinate our online chat team, which is generally pretty hands-off other than right as the shift ends, when I generally jump in to monitor any active chats and make sure they close up quickly. I don't want to keep my guys here any longer than necessary. They like it better, and it cuts down on overtime hours for the entire line of business by a lot. This means I generally rack up 15-20 min of overtime a day, though some days it can be as little as 0 and others as much as an hour. My direct boss knows all about this and is generally all for it. One day, however, the guy who was in charge of all the support teams we work with many brands sent out a memo that management should never be getting overtime. I brought this up with my boss as this would seriously impact my team, who arranged a meeting with the big boss. Big boss proceeds to tell my boss that no, I cannot rack up any overtime hours. Fine. I get out at a reasonable time every day. I have 0 issue with this. So the next Monday, I log out right when my shift ends. Turns out 3 of my guys were there for an extra hour with last-minute chats. Tuesday, nearly the same story. This continues all through the week. We are bleeding overtime hours for support staff, with most of my team getting nearly an hour of OT per day. This goes on for a pay period when Big Boss comes back and tells us we were told to reduce OT hours and that we had somehow racked up even more than we had before. My boss backed me up and told the Big Boss that no, we were told to reduce management OT hours and that I had indeed not racked up any overtime. Big Boss asks why OT hours increased, and I mentioned I stayed to make sure my team had support they needed to get out as early as possible. Big Boss goes, "Well, that makes sense, keep doing that, but add any overtime to your Friday lunch so you don't rack up overtime." I explain that I can do this, but will still probably get a bit of OT on Fridays since the end of the shift is obviously after lunch. Again, cool. Long lunches are nice. This works well for a few weeks. I am making sure I zero out my OT. But I knew it was only a matter of time before they regretted doing any of this. We were approaching the busy season and getting more and more long chats and calls. I made sure to get Big Boss to email and CC me and my boss this instruction directly. Sure enough, a few weeks later, Monday, I'm there for a whopping hour and 30 min trying to get one guy out the door. Tuesday for an hour, Wednesday for an hour 15, and to top it off, 2 whole hours on Thursday. It was a terrible week for the last-minute chats. I tally up my makeup time for my lunch, 5 hours and 45 minutes, plus an hour for my normal lunch. I normally worked 4 hours, 1 hour lunch, then another 4 hours. So that Friday, I came in and explained the situation to my boss. He was cool with me working for only 2 hours and 15 min the whole day, because I was doing exactly what the big boss said to do. So an hour into my shift, I go on my 6-hour and 45-minute lunch. While I'm enjoying my most of day siesta, the entire line of business is burning down. Chat is so busy we have people waiting 30 min to speak with someone. Calls are so busy we have 15 calls waiting. On days like this, I normally jump in the queues as I do not need to document every case like our tier 1s have to, and I'm very good at my job. I can usually knock out a 15-20 min call for a tier 1 in 5 minutes or less. I can easily handle 4 or 5 chats at one time, seriously taking a load off that team. Now I alone could not save this shift, no way. We were due for a hiring class and were working on onboarding new tier 1s at the time. But man, does it look bad to the client when one of your key players is absent all but 2 hours and 15 min of one of the busiest days ever for our lob. I get back in, settle down at my desk, right as the rush is clearing up. The damage was already done, and we were manageable for the rest of the day. Right at the end of my shift, I look and notice that there is no one on a chat, and no queue, so I immediately log out and thank my team for working hard that day. Then Monday comes. I get to meet with the client, big boss, and my boss for our weekly meeting. The client is furious about how on Friday, one of our best assets was on a super long lunch break, and big boss puts me on the spot and asks why that was. My response was rehearsed. According to company policy established and agreed upon on date, we met with the big boss. I am not to accrue overtime hours. Any hours over 8 worked within the work week must be made up during my lunch break on Fridays. Big boss began denying it when my boss stepped in and was like, "Wait, I got an email about this." He pulls up the email big boss sent and shares it on screen in the meeting. Client is pissed, and the corporate rep begins ripping big boss a new one on the phone. After ripping into big boss, the corp rep speaks to me, telling me to accrue as many hours as needed to make sure my job is done, and that if my company wants to retain this line of business, big boss is not to interfere with my generally very successful management without consulting them and myself. Since then, big boss has continued to try to interfere and change how I run my line. However, every time so far, the corporate rep has had my back. They are extremely happy with my work and know I do a great job. Heck, they even pushed through a large raise for me when big boss was blocking my boss's attempts to get me more money. I hope you guys like this video. If you did, make sure like, comment, share, and subscribe the channel our posts.